So it's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I am your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from my home in Fort Wright, Kentucky. Also joining me by the powers of Zoom is my assistant for this evening, BCM Service Associate Heather Cook, and our presenter for this evening, Danny Weddle. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's History Museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and our members. If you are not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. You can learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. So let's learn more about tonight's presenter. Danny Weddle retired from WFTM Radio in Maysville in 2019 after 40 years as a sports play-by-play announcer. He now serves as a tour guide for the city of Maysville. He's vice chairman of the Maysville Area Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors and a partner at Cross Point Community Church. He shares local stories and insights on his blog, Courtside with Danny Weddle, and his podcast, Conversations with Danny Weddle. He is also the author of How We Play the Game, A History of High School Basketball in Maysville and Mason County, and Talking Sports and more. Danny and his wife Glenda have 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. Now we have a reminder before we get started. We always love participation from our viewers, so we want your questions. So please type those questions or comments you have in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. Now it's trivia time. Tonight's trivia question is, name the Maysville native who appeared in the 1934 comedy mystery movie, The Thin Man. Go ahead and type your answers in the chat and we will announce the winner at the end of the presentation. Okay, I guess we're ready to get started. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter. So there you go, Danny.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for everyone joining us. I'm going to talk a lot about Maysville-Mason County tonight, a community that I'm proud of, born and raised here, and we think we have a great city here. A lot of history that includes pioneers, Revolutionary War heroes, Civil War, and then unfortunately, more recent wars. I'm going to do a little slideshow here. I'm going to start out and kind of go through some historic events in the city. I want to start the first presentation with that. And then the second part, I want to talk about the many characters that we have. And that's what I talk a lot about on our tours. But let's get started with the history of the town a little bit. And we're going to start with this guy here, Simon Kenton. Kenton County name for him. Simon Kenton is known as the father of Mason County, one of the early settlers, not necessarily the first person that came through. Captain John Hedges came through before Kenton and actually named the area, the creek that emptied into the Ohio River and the natural harbor, called them Limestone, and that's what they were known originally. But Simon Kenton comes along. He'd been coming down the Ohio River looking for the cane lands of Kentucky, made several trips and didn't find them, and finally he arrived in Limestone. Settled in 1784 by Edward and John Waller and George Lewis. They put a blockhouse up right in downtown Maysville. The town was named Maysville in 1787 for John May. May and Simon Kenton had done a lot of surveying here. This sign says that John May actually owned property in Maysville. I've read other places where he did a lot of surveying, but actually didn't live here, but he did have a lot of land here. Unfortunately for him, he was killed in an Indian attack on the Ohio River near Portsmouth, Ohio, coming back from Virginia in 1790. So 1784, the community starts, named Maysville in 1787. Actually, the year before that, Washington is established as a town about 5 miles south of the Ohio River. When the early settlers arrived, there were a lot of Indian attacks, kind of landlocked. The hillside was there. So a lot of people moved south to Washington and to Kenton Station. Simon Kenton put up a fort or station, had 17 to 18 cabins. I've seen both figures, and there was safety in numbers in that fort. Now, Tecumseh, Shawnee Indian chief, led a raid on Maysville in his teenage years around 1785. So those attacks were pretty deadly, pretty prominent. And along comes a man by the name of Daniel Boone. Boone actually lived here for 4 or 5 years, In the 1780s, he was a trustee here. His cousin Jacob ran a tavern on the riverfront, and that building still stood until the 1937 flood. But Boone, there's been different stories of whether he helped Jacob Boone or he actually was in competition with Jacob Boone as a tavern owner. Daniel Boone did a lot of surveying here, was elected to the Virginia legislature. One author says that Daniel Boone says some of his happiest times were in his time in Limestone or Maysville. And actually, the name of the city was referred to both Limestone and Maysville for many years. You can find some court documents up into the 1800s where it was still known as Limestone in some of the documents. Here's an interesting thing. August 20th, 1787, a party of 60 Shawnees under Black Snake Wolf and Captain Johnny came to the mouth of the fishing gun on the Ohio River opposite of Maysville, and they exchanged prisoners. You see down there below, the Shawnees made a solemn pledge to Boone to take care of Maysville citizens. That was in 1787. Now, this is what the natural harbor looked like. This is Limestone Creek emptying into the Ohio River. This is one of our flood wall murals painted by Bob Daffert. You can see the flatboats. Those people put everything they owned on those flatboats, sailed down the river, had those oars. The river was very shallow at times. They actually had to watch the weather and come down where they wouldn't get stuck. If they went to either shore, they were under the threat of Indian attacks. And Washington became the county seat of Mason County. Washington was a much more prominent town then. You can read some people's journals, and they kind of disparaged Maysville. There wasn't much here then. So they built the courthouse. Lewis Craig was a stonemason and a Baptist minister, brought his traveling church to Mason County, and he put up the courthouse. And all the court was held in Washington, very small community, later on, but it was a bustling community back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Now we're going to go ahead to 1825, and Lafayette, on his triumphal return of the United States, and was saluted all over the place. He came to Maysville on the riverboat, the Herald. They landed at the river. They paraded him up the street to Eagle Tavern. You can see the red carpet rolled out there for him, and the river was much lower. There was a cliff there, and they wined and dined him here for a couple of hours. Then he got back on the Herald and headed up the river. Now, we reenacted that. The 200th anniversary was May 21st of this year, and Jacob from the museum came and actually reenacted Lafayette, so that was a big deal to have that. Now, here's an interesting story that really I don't think a lot of people knew about until recently when they put up these signs, but around the turn of the century there, 1800s, Maysville built ships, a full-fledged ship named Maysville, and they transported oak, pine, hemp, and whiskey. And this is really an amazing story. You can see there on the sign on the right, a multiracial crew of 10 sailed to Russia. So Maysville shipbuilding. And again, I think if you ask a lot of Maysville residents, they would not have been aware of that until that sign went up in recent years. 1833, Maysville becomes incorporated, but something more interesting happened down in Washington. This is the Marshall Key House. Was first the Francis Taylor House, but Marshall Key. And during a weekend in 1833, his daughter, Elizabeth Key, brought home Harriet Beecher and another teacher from Cincinnati, Mary Dutton. And while they were in Washington, remember it was the courthouse or county seat, they went just a couple blocks down the street, witnessed a slave auction, and about 20 years later, a slave auction on the courthouse steps in Washington, Kentucky, ended up in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's believed a couple of characters in the book, Topsy and Eliza, were from remembrances that she had of her visit in Washington. We're going to get back more to the Marshall Key House when I get into more of the characters of the community. This big house here is at the corner of Sutton and 3rd Streets in downtown Maysville. William Phillips was the second mayor of Maysville. He starts building this mansion, and according to the story that's been handed down for many years, he ran out of money, and it became known as Phillips Folly. Well, many years later, we're still calling it Phillips Folly. Legend has it he went to New Orleans, won some money gambling, and came back and finished the structure. It's believed to be a stop on the Underground Railroad. Also believed to be haunted. One of the ghost shows came here several years ago and did an episode. Drew quite the crowd down on Sutton Street. But if you come to town, that's certainly an interesting building to look at. Okay, this hole in the wall of the Presbyterian Church, a block away from Phillips Folly, this was created in August of 1854. There was a huge gunpowder explosion at the bottom of what we call the old 68 hill, and it sent debris all through the valley, sent huge rocks all the way across the river to Aberdeen, damaged virtually every building downtown, and left this crater in the Presbyterian Church, and it is still there. If you walk down the street, you can see that crater. They never figured out who set off the explosion, but you could hear it 40 miles away. There's a story in the New York Times about the gunpowder magazine explosion. Now, this building was built as City Hall in 1845. Maysville wanted the county seat, so they put up a building that looked like a courthouse and named it City Hall. Well, 3 years later, they got the county seat, but they built the courthouse before they actually had the county seat. And this was our working courthouse until 2000 when they built a new structure. We had streetcars, 1883. And this was a big deal because I did some research. I actually did a presentation on the streetcars at the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center a couple of years ago, but I did some more research as I was getting ready for this. These streetcars were supposed to arrive, and they finally did in August of 1883. They were horse-drawn or mule-drawn until 1891, and then they became electric-pulled. And those ran until December 31st, 1936. This is the Cox Building, one of our landmarks in downtown Maysville, built by the Cox brothers in 1886. One of the brothers, William Cox, went on to serve as lieutenant governor in the early 1900s, and the governor was Augustus Wilson, who was also from Maysville. But this Cox Building caught on fire in 2009. The city owned it. Thankfully, they had it insured and brought it back better than ever. Built as the Masonic Lodge, it's still the Masonic Lodge. There's a banquet room. Our Chamber of Commerce office is there. There's a new restaurant in the corner. Certainly one of our landmarks. And that day that building caught on fire, I came home and really thought we'd lost it. But thankfully, it's better than ever. Opera Theater. This has an interesting story to it. This is actually the second structure. The first one burned down. There's been some fires on this block. Actually, the Presbyterian Church building that preceded the white one that had the crater in it was called the Blue Church. It was located right here where the Opera Theater was. Well, there was a massive fire in that block, burned it down. They put up the theater, and in 1898, a stable just up the street caught on fire and burnt down the theater, and they rebuilt this structure. There was actually another fire there in 1930, but the Opera Theater is home to the Maysville Players, one of the oldest theater groups in Kentucky. They do 4 or 5 productions a year, and that's a building they raised a lot of money to renovate that building. Jerry Lee Lewis played there in the 60s. Will Geer, who was grandpa on the Waltons, performed there in the 20s. George Clooney, Renee Zellweger premiered their movie Leatherheads there at the theater. And here recently, Bruce Carlson, who owns Carlson Software, a mining software company headquartered in Maysville, he has his company convention here, and he has brought Peter Noonan, Three Dog Night, Casey and the Sunshine Band. So it's really an interesting theater. It used to be a movie theater. And speaking of movie theaters, this is the Russell Theater, opened in 1930. Mr. Russell sold his stock in 1920, before the 1929 stock market crash, and he spent a whopping $125,000 on this theater. A beautiful facility. What he said, what the Roxy is to New York, the Russell is going to be to Maysville. Whoopi, starring Eddie Cantor, was the first movie shown there. And we'll talk a little bit more about Rosemary Clooney premiering her movie there. Roof blew off, had a lot of damage. The lobby has been restored. They still need to do some work on the theater, but they do still show movies there on Saturday nights. Okay, 1931, we dedicated what became the Simon Kent Memorial Bridge. This was a big deal because there were no bridges at that time between Cincinnati and Portsmouth, and that's about 110, 120-mile distance. And a ferry system ran in Maysville prior to the bridge being built. They built this bridge for $1.57 million. It was a toll bridge for the first 14 years. Unfortunately, the weight limits on it have been dropped to 15 tons. We're really working hard to keep semis off of it, but thankfully we have another bridge downriver. We'll talk about it in a second. But this was a big deal when they opened this bridge. People came from all over. 10 to 15,000 people, it's estimated, came for the dedication of what became the Simon Kenton Memorial Bridge. 1937, we had a horrific flood throughout the Ohio Valley. People in Cincinnati know all about that. There are all kinds of floods about every year, but in 1937, the river crested at 75.4 feet. Now, this is a high water mark on a building about 3 blocks from the river. Just a devastating flood. Martial law was declared in Maysville, millions of dollars of damage. The water reached the second floor of many buildings downtown. Now, in 1951, Maysville elected Rebecca Hord as its mayor, and she was the first female mayor in the state of Kentucky. And she really pushed to build the flood wall. And her daughter and grandson later became mayors of Maysville. Her grandson is still a city commissioner. Here's the Russell Theater. This was the parade they had for Rosemary. In 1953, she premiered her movie, The Stars Are Singing at the Russell Theater. And again, this is one of our murals. This is the parade. You can see people in the background. Again, thousands of people came for this parade. Rosemary there in the mink coat waving. The African-American lady in the front seat is Blanche Chambers, her lifelong friend. In fact, Blanche outlived Rosemary. Rosemary made sure that Blanche sat with her at the premiere of that movie. Back in those days, African Americans had to sit upstairs in their own balcony. Rosemary says, no, she's sitting downstairs with me. And if you get the opportunity to tour the Russell Theater, you'll see a photo of Rosemary sitting in the back row with Blanche. That's her grandmother there in the middle seat, Mrs. Guilfoyle, with the flowered hat. Dallas Queen, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, was driving the car. And down here on the right-hand side, those little figures are from White Christmas. Bing Crosby, Danny Kaye, Rosemary. Now here's the flood wall, opened in the mid-50s. And it's 14,000 feet long. 7,700 is the concrete structure you see here. And the rest is an earthen levee, mainly in the east end of town. Now, these houses here face the river. That's Front Street. So Front Street ran along the river back in the day before the flood wall came along, but it would have run all through the downtown. In this area right here where I took this picture, there were many buildings, but they were torn down for urban renewal in the 60s. Maysville Community College, now Maysville Community and Technical College, opened in 1968. They actually had classes in churches downtown before they built their building out on top of the hill. Dr. Charles Wethington, who was the first director, basically the president of the college, but they called it director back then, he went on to become president of the University of Kentucky. But they have campuses in Paris, Cynthiana, Mount Sterling, and Rowan County. It really is a regional campus. Fleming-Mason Airport was dedicated in 1973. This was a big deal. And this is a huge airport. You can land jets out there. They have expanded it since it opened. It's a Flemingsburg and Mason County got together and built this airport. It really is a nice facility. Meadowview Regional Medical Center opened in 1983, replaced Hayeswood Hospital. It's hard to believe it's been there since 1983. And the AA Highway opened in the 80s and 90s, opened in sections, and really opened us up to northern Kentucky. Prior to the AA Highway opening, to go to Cincinnati, most people crossed the river and went US 52, or you come down Mary Ingles Highway on Kentucky 8. The AA Highway certainly opened us up to a lot of industry. We have a lot of industrial parks, and it's a pretty quick trip to Cincinnati that way. Actually, I tell our visitors the AA Highway was designed to go from Alexandria to Ashland. It really doesn't go to either place. It cuts between Cold Spring and Alexandria, and now ends up at the Newport Levee. And eastbound, there's actually 2 spurs of it. You can eventually get to Ashland, but it really doesn't go to Ashland. And this is the William Harsha Bridge, opened in 2000. Hard to believe it's been here 25 years. 1990, Washington was having some water issues, so they merged with Maysville. They're one city now, but we've been able to keep the historic district, and it's really pretty much now a neighborhood of Maysville. We have Simon Kenton Line, and we have a Simon Kenton statue in Washington. I started out with the Simon Kenton statue. That is in Limestone Park in downtown Maysville, park built by Mr. Carlson, who I mentioned earlier. But when they built the Maysville Cemetery in the late 1840s, they said, we're going to put up a statue for Simon Kenton. Well, it never happened until Mr. Carlson did it, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, probably. And this statue in Washington went up, I believe, 3 years ago during the Simon Kenton Festival. So that's kind of a history of the town. And I highlighted some of the major events there. And we're going to get into the characters now. There's a whole list. I've got a whole page of characters here, and we could probably go to 9 o'clock, but no one wants to listen to me that long. The first guy I'm going to start with is John Coulter. John Coulter was one of the 9 young men from Kentucky who went on the Lewis and Clark expedition. He moved here as a young man, and he actually became more famous after the Lewis and Clark expedition. He stayed out west, became a fur trader, and is believed to be the first white person to visit Yellowstone. In fact, he comes back talking about the geysers and everything shooting up out of the earth, and became known as Coulter's Hell. So John Coulter, certainly an interesting character from Maysville that we claim. Now I'm going to throw a lot of names at you, and I hope I keep them straight, and I hope you keep them straight. Thomas Marshall was a contemporary of George Washington. He fought with George Washington, surveyed with George Washington. He and his wife came down the river and settled in central Kentucky and surveyed in central Kentucky. He was the father of Chief Justice John Marshall. They had 15 children. Well, one of the other sons was also named Thomas Marshall. He also came down the river, built a log cabin near Washington. But a little bit before 1800, or around 1800, he wants to build this big mansion known as Federal Hill in Washington. So his parents come home, help him build it. The parents actually die there and are buried in the cemetery behind the house. Now, there's no record in the newspaper or anything of John Marshall coming to town, but I feel like if both of his parents lived here and died here, he probably came to town. But the Marshall family, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as we get through the presentation, just a remarkable family. If you married a Marshall or you were a Marshall, you can still be buried in the active cemetery behind that house. That house has become in some bad repair. They did put a new roof on it. YouTube video of the inside of the house when they had an open house. I've been out of town both times, but the inside actually looks better than the outside. But it has been transferred to the Elizabeth Wallingford Foundation, which has done a lot of historic work in Washington. So hopefully we can get that renewed to what it used to be. Really a beautiful home. And William Lewis Marshall, great grandson of Old Man Marshall, he actually discovered Marshall's Pass. He was a surveyor out in Colorado, and Marshall's Pass through the Rocky Mountains is named for William Marshall. He also did a lot of canal work in Illinois, and he also did some work, canal work in New York Harbor. He was a great guy in the Army Corps of Engineers, and he is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Okay, here's an interesting house. 2 generals who fought in the Civil War on opposite sides lived in this house at 2 separate times. The first one was Albert Sidney Johnston. His dad was a Connecticut physician who moved to Washington, practiced here. Albert Sidney Johnston went to Transylvania, went to West Point, fought in the Black Hawk War, Mexican War. He was actually out in California when the state started seceding from the Union. He hops on a horse, rides from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and him and some other men ride from Los Angeles to Richmond, Virginia, and Johnston signs up for the Confederacy. Well, the Johnston family moves out, and the Nelson family moves in. Mr. Nelson is also a doctor. One of his sons is William Bull Nelson. Nelson has a great Navy career. You can read about him. He sailed all across the world. And Kutuzov, the Hungarian revolutionary, he comes to America, and Nelson shows him around America. Well, Nelson and Johnston both end up at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee. And another general with a connection to Maysville, Ulysses S. Grant, is also there as well. Grant's father lived in Maysville for a period of time, moved to Point Pleasant, Ohio, and then they moved to Georgetown, Ohio, which is about 25 miles from here. Ulysses S. Grant comes to Maysville and attends in a famous academy, the Maysville Academy, for 1 year. So you've got 3 guys with connections to Maysville, all fighting at the Battle of Shiloh. Nelson and Grant for the North, Johnston for the South. Johnston dies in the Battle of Shiloh, killed, I believe, by friendly fire. It's interesting there. You got 3 guys with that connection, 2 of them to this house, and all 3 of them to the community. It's wild. Actually, I want to talk a little bit more about I showed you the Marshall Key House. Elizabeth Key had 2 brothers. who we're finding out played kind of prominent roles in the Civil War that we might not have known about until recent years. John James Key was one of her brothers, and he was with General Halleck. And after the Battle of Antietam, an officer asked Key why they didn't go after the South, McClellan's forces, after the Battle of Antietam. And Key says this is what's quoted as Key saying, "That is not the game. The object is that neither army shall gain much advantage over the other, that both shall be kept in the field until they're exhausted. We'll make a compromise and save slavery." Well, word gets back to President Lincoln, and Lincoln calls John James Key to the White House, and they have a heart-to-heart. Lincoln ends up giving Key an honorable discharge. He says, "You can't serve with this attitude." And a big key to this was, pardon the pun, is the other brother, Thomas Marshall Key, was General McClellan's aide de camp. So Key's brother is with McClellan, and John James Key is saying this. Well, soon after Key and Lincoln have this meeting, John James Key's son is killed at the Battle of Perryville. Well, Key and Lincoln write back and forth to each other. And Lincoln writes this very eloquent letter, as probably only Lincoln could do, sends his condolences about the son, and again explains to Key that he can't serve in the military with this attitude. Well, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in New York City says that letter from Lincoln to Key is one of the most important 600 documents in the history of the United States. And as I said, Thomas Marshall Key was with McClellan, and there's a guy here, an author that about 12 or 13 years ago wrote a book, and he blames McClellan for not being aggressive. He lays that right at the feet of Thomas Marshall Key. So it's interesting how all the history goes together. And we'll tie something else here. Bull Nelson, who died at the Galt House, he disparages another Union soldier who ironically was named Jefferson Davis. That Jefferson Davis grabs a gun, shoots and kills Bull Nelson. Nelson is buried in the Maysville Cemetery. Camp Nelson, south of Lexington, is named for Bull Nelson. But Bull Nelson has a brother named Thomas Nelson, and he marries a young lady from Washington by the name of Elizabeth Key, the young lady that brought Harriet Beecher to Washington. Again, it's all connected. Okay, Thomas Nelson had met Lincoln before Lincoln was president. Lincoln remembers him, and once Lincoln is president, he needs an ambassador to Chile. So he appoints Thomas Nelson to Chile. Thomas and Elizabeth go to Chile. While they're there, there's this humongous fire at a Catholic church in Santiago. It's possibly one of the deadliest fires in the history of the world. We don't know ancient history, but some people have said this is one of the deadliest fires on record. Between 2,000 and 3,000 people were killed in that fire. I've seen the number of 2,300. Most of them are young women because it was a service for young women. Thomas Nelson and the rest of the American delegation go down and save some people. Nelson is a hero in Chile. In fact, the next 4th of July celebration is in honor of Thomas Nelson. They come home. Grant is president, and he needs an ambassador to Mexico. So he appoints Nelson to Mexico. Thomas and Elizabeth go to Mexico. Elizabeth dies while he's serving there. He wants to come home immediately. Grant can't find anyone to replace him. So Nelson stays a little bit longer. Elizabeth dies in Mexico. So again, his two brother-in-laws are the two Key brothers who are with McClellan and with Halleck. It's all connected. It's crazy how it all goes together. Okay, you keeping that straight so far? If not, you can comment, and I'll try to figure it out for you. And that Marshall Key was a nephew of the Marshall family that I talked about earlier. Okay, this house right here, a 3-year-old black child by the name of Thornton Blackburn was taken from his mother in Maysville and sold into slavery into this household. This family had a young child. They wanted a playmate, and they also wanted a young slave. So Thornton Blackburn grows up in this house. When he's 13 years old, they sell him to a family in Hardinsburg, Kentucky, Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown dies, and they sell Thornton to a family in Louisville. Thornton is working at a dry goods company in Louisville. He meets a lady named Ruthie. She's 28. He's 19. They get married. They find out that she's going to be sold down the river, possibly to Natchez, Mississippi, or even to New Orleans. Well, they forge some paperwork. go across the river to southern Indiana and hop on the riverboat Versailles. They take the Versailles to Cincinnati. They get off the boat, take a stagecoach to Detroit, and think they're going to live happily ever after. They're there 2 or 3 years, and wouldn't you know it, someone from Louisville comes along and spots Thornton Blackburn and tells the Kentucky authorities. Well, they have him arrested. He's thrown in jail, and both of them are thrown in jail in Detroit. 2 women go in to visit Ruthie to pray with her. One of them changes clothes with her, and Ruthie escapes. Well, they don't know any way to get Thornton out other than have riots. So they have these riots, now known as the Blackburn riots. He breaks out. A deputy jailer is injured. The Blackburns make it to Canada. Well, the Americans, the U.S. goes to Canada and wants them back. Canadians say, nope, they didn't do anything here. They're staying here. Their case is actually one of the principles for slaves making it to Canada being free. Thornton Blackburn dies in 1890. This story is not known until there's an archaeological dig in Toronto at a school site in 1985. They dig up the remains of the Blackburn's house. One of the archaeologists is from Yale, and she figuratively and literally continues digging, comes all the way to Maysville, researches the story, and writes a book, I've Got a Home in Glory Land. Come to find out, the Blackburns became fairly prosperous. They couldn't read or write, but they started a horse and buggy taxi service and helped other slaves once they got to Canada. Now, if you look up Thornton Blackburn, all through Black history in Canada, you'll find out their story. But amazing that it was not known for 95 years. Who we want to throw at you next? Let's see. Elisha Green was born into slavery in Paris, Kentucky, sold to a family in Mason County, and he gets freedom for himself and for his family, and he becomes a Baptist minister. He starts a church in Maysville, Bethel Baptist Church, and he starts a church in Paris. And in the stagecoach days, he goes back and forth between the 2 cities on alternate Sundays. The train comes along, and he starts taking the train. One time he's on the train, and it stops in Millersburg, a community between Maysville and Paris. They have a women's college there. 2 men from the college get on and demand that Elisha Green give up his seat. He refuses to do it. He later said, if they'd asked me kindly, I would have gotten up. Well, they assault him, and he presses charges, wins a whopping $24 from them in damages. But he goes on to found other churches. Really is an amazing story, and Elisha Green is his name. You can actually read his autobiography online. Another African-American I want to tell you about, James Mundy. He was an organist at that same Bethel Baptist Church. He goes to Chicago and becomes this famous choir director. When they dedicate the Navy Pier in Chicago, he's directing the choir. When they rededicate Lincoln's Memorial gravesite in Springfield, Illinois, he's there with the choir. He leads a choir of 1,000 at Carnegie Hall. James Mundy, another interesting guy. Zachary Taylor, his first military assignment was as a recruiter in Washington in 1809. Another story that was buried that was just recently discovered was Absalom Markland. Markland was born in Winchester, Kentucky, moves here as a teenager, goes to that same academy that Grant went to, and works on riverboats. He was kind of the FedEx of the day. If you wanted something delivered on a riverboat, you gave it to Absalom Markland. He's working for the Postal Service. He's in Cairo, Illinois, and he has a chance meeting with Grant. Grant and him had gone to school together. Grant recognizes Markland and finds out what he's doing. He actually puts Markland in charge of getting the mail to the Union soldiers throughout the Civil War. And Markland is credited, this lady recently wrote this book, credited with getting those letters to the soldiers and really keeping their spirits up. Grant would get to Vicksburg. The next day, the letters would be there. Sherman goes through Atlanta, gets to Savannah, and Markland has taken a ship down the coast and gets the letters there. It's really an amazing story. Grant ends up giving his saddle to Absalom Markland. This story really was not known until this author she was going to do a book about letters from the wives of Lincoln's cabinet. And she does all this research, and she keeps seeing Absalom Markland's name, and she writes this book about him. So it's really interesting how this history develops. Theodore Berry, the first African-American mayor of Cincinnati, is from Maysville. The street from Paycor Stadium, where the Bengals play, to the National Freedom Center is named for Theodore Berry. Interesting thing about the Freedom Center, the last thing you see there, unfortunately, is a slave pen. That slave pen was in a tobacco barn in Mason County until about the 1990s. They take this barn off and find this slave pen. And Mason County, I think, kind of wanted to keep the slave pen. It ends up going to Cincinnati, which probably in the end is a good thing because more people see it. But it's really it's scary to see and to think that existed. But if you've been through the National Freedom Center, that is one of the last things you'll see. Stanley Foreman Reed was the Supreme Court Justice for Maysville, appointed by FDR, and he was on the Brown versus Education case. He's really a well-known Supreme Court Justice for Maysville because he was from the community of Minerva. We have another Supreme Court Justice who lived here briefly, John McLean. His family moved around a lot. They lived in Cincinnati. They lived here briefly, but he served, and he was one of the 2 dissenting votes on the Dred Scott case. Another interesting thing that I probably should have put in the history of Maysville, and I think I meant to put it in there, in 1930 was the Maysville Road Bill. Henry Clay wanted federal funds to build a road from Maysville to Lexington. They'd already built a road from Maysville to Washington, but the House and Senate both approved this money for the road. Well, Andrew Jackson vetoed it, and they did not get enough votes to override it. It was kind of a case that first tested spending federal money in states. If you go back and look at that, that is a pretty famous Supreme Court case. I talked a little bit about Rosemary Clooney. Of course, her sister Betty Clooney sang with her. Nick Clooney, their younger brother, TV anchorman in Cincinnati. He's from Maysville. He actually worked at WFTM when he after he got out of St. Patrick's School. And of course, Nick is George's father, Walt Mayer, another guy who worked at the local radio station for Maysville, worked at Channel 9 and Channel 12 for a lot of years. And we've had 3 fairly famous beauty queens from Maysville. Ida Lewis in the mid-'70s was the first African-American Miss Kentucky. 1992, Angela Hines was Miss Kentucky USA. And in 2000, Heather Renee French Henry, was Miss America 2000. So we've had our beauty queens here. And that's just some of the people I've touched on. There's probably a lot of people I could mention. I know we're getting close to my 45 minutes being up. If you want to ask some questions, I told when we started, before we got on, I said I like to learn something new about the community every day. And I found something out today. William Pelham from Maysville was a Confederate governor of New Mexico during the Civil War. His dad, Major Charles Pelham, was a Revolutionary War hero. And when Lafayette came to Maysville, Charles Pelham kind of led the parade. In fact, there's a street named for Mr. Pelham here. Alexander Donovan, another guy I normally mention on my tours. Alexander Donovan was born near Washington. He went out to Missouri, became a very prominent attorney, fought with the Missouri militia. One of the people they fought was Joseph Smith of the Mormon faith. Joseph Smith, his brother, and I think 3 other men eventually surrendered to the Missouri militia. They had a court-martial. They were sentenced to a firing squad. Donovan was told that he was going to carry out that firing squad. Donovan says, I'm not going to do it. And if you do it, I'm going to hold you accountable. They ended up letting Smith go. Donovan later leads a march from Fort Leavenworth down through Mexico, 3,500 miles. That has been considered one of the longest military marches in the history of the United States. So go back. That letter from Lincoln to John James Key, one of the most important 600 documents in the history of the United States. Thomas Nelson is on the scene of one of the deadliest fires in the world, and Alexander Donovan leads this 3,500-mile march. It's crazy, this history. And I didn't get into Daniel Drake. Daniel Drake, a famous physician in Cincinnati. He founded what became University of Cincinnati and the Cincinnati Medical College. He came down the river in a flotilla with another doctor, William Goforth, who established a practice in Washington. Drake's family moves out to Mays Lick. Goforth moves to Cincinnati, becomes a doctor. Drake studies under him. Goforth goes over to what is now Big Bone Lick State Park gets all these bones. Thomas Jefferson finds out about it when he sends Meriwether Lewis down the river. He says, go get some of these bones from Goforth. I want them. So Goforth gives the bones to Lewis. They put them on a boat, send them down the Mississippi River. The boat sinks. Later, a guy by the name of Thomas Ashe comes along, finds out about the bones. He said, let's sell these in Europe. We can make a lot of money. Goforth says, do it. Well, Thomas Ashe takes them to Liverpool, England, sells the bones. Goforth never gets a penny. Of course, Drake becomes, a pioneer doctor. Just it's an amazing history, and I've just touched the tip of the iceberg. If you want to learn more, you got to come to Maysville.
Well, thank you so much, Danny. There's a lot of history. That was a wonderful presentation. I want to go back to our trivia question because we had a correct answer. We had a response right away, actually. So again, that question was, name the Maysville native who appeared in the 1934 comedy mystery movie, The Thin Man. And that answer was Henry Wadsworth. Actually, Joseph Henry, but Henry Wadsworth. And who was our winner, Heather?
It was Ron Bailey.
He's a ringer.
Well, he knew it right away. So
I tell you, Ron has a webpage that I want to recommend. Ron is a great historian, a cohort, a good friend of mine. But he has a Facebook page. You may be from Maysville if you remember. I think it's up to 30,000 followers. People put pictures on there. And I told you, Mary Jane, before, he holds a meeting at the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center every Tuesday at 1:00. And it's amazing the people that come and share stories. It's really fascinating. Hey, I got a couple of more slides I want to show you, kind of from the tourism business here, if you don't mind.
No, go for
it. Just to follow up a little bit about what I was talking about. Okay, again, that's the house that Blackburn was in. There's Stanley Foreman Reed's plaque. This is the Maysville Academy site. Unfortunately, it fell in around 1997. The city bought it, couldn't save it. You can still see some footers there, but a lot of famous people went to that academy. This is the Bierbauer house. The Bierbauer family moved from Pennsylvania. They had a carriage factory here that, believe it or not, it burned down. But they were abolitionists, and it's believed that slaves were hidden in that house, and that's now the National Underground Museum Center. If you come on Thursdays, Fridays, or Saturdays, you can do a guided tour of there. Frederick Bierbauer, one of their sons, was on the Perry expedition in the 1850s that opened up trade with Japan. He came back and served as a mayor of Maysville. Here's our opening in the flood wall that we made. This is kind of gives you the experience that the pioneers would have. This really opened it up in, I think, 1992, where we have access to the river. And now we have riverboats come. We had 3 this year. We've had as many as 10 or 12 in years past, but they come, spend the day. We take them on tours. They spend a lot of money here. This is the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center. Has the world's largest private collection of miniatures. Unbelievable. One trip won't do it. And then at Washington, the Washington Visitor Center is open Thursday through Monday, 10 to 4. You can come and get tours there. And this is going to be new history. The Lundgren family, Jerry Lundgren and his family, are building the 14 Stations of the Cross, 14 life-size shrines of Christ's final day, Gethsemane Gardens. They've been working on this since the spring. They hope to have it done by next Easter. There's a visitor center that's going to be there. This is actually going to be something. They're working on it. Those guys work. Of course, they haven't had much rain until this week. But check back next. And Elisha Green, I mentioned, the African-American pastor. We just found out today we've been holding this fund drive to raise $65,000 to build a statue for him. We've reached that goal just today.
Wow, wonderful. That's great to hear. And I love seeing you touching on the Gateway Museum. It is a must-see. I had the privilege of visiting Maysville not too long ago with our curator of collections, Jason French, where he was Lafayette in your big celebration that you had there. And we actually did some curators chats that I encourage everybody to check out on our YouTube channel. We did some on, I know we did one on Old Washington. We've got more coming. We're actually still working on, so there's more to come.
2 more guys I want to list. I have my list here. Judge Roy Bean was from Mason County. He was actually from a little community, Springdale, which is no longer there. Dreveau Lime came in, started a mining operation, and bought up the town. And Joshua Bean, his brother, was the first mayor of San Diego. So two more. What I like to tell my people on my trolley tour: imagine a bicycle wheel. We're the hub, and all these names I list are the spokes. And hopefully, when I finish the tour, we have that wheel finished. So I hope I did that tonight.
Yes, you definitely did. Okay, Heather, I think I do see that Ron also pointed out there's another famous person that's associated with the museum that's from Maysville, our own Ellis Crawford.
I mentioned that to you when we started, and I did not know that. I told you I did not know that until the other night. Ron and I host trivia at the museum, and an interesting thing that ties him in with Goforth is Mr. Crawford did a lot of work at Big Bone Lick State Park.
Yes. Okay, Heather, do we have some questions?
Yes, we did have one that was, did Simon Kenton ever live in Washington?
Well, actually, what he did, he actually was in jail in Washington, if you can believe it. He actually sold, and I meant to get into this, he sold the acreage for Washington to William Wood, a Baptist minister, and Arthur Fox, a surveyor. And he had his station just a little bit from here, and he had a general store in Washington. Actually, whether he ever lived in Washington is a good question, but he was thrown into debtor's court in the jail in the town that he helped build. But his station was only about 2 miles from here.
Interesting. We did just have another question come in that was, what kind of history do the rail lines owe in Maysville? I'm not sure what that second last word is supposed to be.
I was going to touch on the railroads a little bit because we had the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. We had the Louisville and Nashville. We actually had two L&N Nashville L&N depots here, a freight depot and a passenger depot. The Chesapeake and Ohio depot is now the Amtrak station. You can catch the Amtrak and go to Chicago to Washington, D.C. or New York. Comes through at about 5 o'clock in the morning, but you can catch it. I've actually taken it to Washington, D.C. And then there was a Maysville to Lexington Railroad that I mentioned Elisha Green rode on. And TTI actually ran it to move coal a few years ago. So we do have a long railroad history. There was a train called the George Washington. Many people that I work with said their father would hop on the train of a morning, get off at Union Terminal, go to a Reds game at Crosley Field, hop back on, and be home in time for dinner. So we do have a big railroad history.
And we've got a lot of great people saying, great presentation. They want to know if you consider doing more presentations.
If you'll listen to me, but I encourage you to come to town because there is a lot to see. I didn't even get into the distillery. Pogue Distillery has been brought back. There were 3 distilleries in Maysville: Pogue, Points Brothers, and Rogers Distillery have a long history. And Pogue, you can tour it, I believe Thursday, Friday, and Saturday by appointment. Go on their website, Old Pogue. You can tour that. You can tour Washington, Maysville. Downtown Maysville, trying to revitalize. You know, the downtown was hurt by big box stores. I'm going to get my Chamber of Commerce hat on here. But we've got a great entrepreneurial spirit. There's all kinds of restaurants downtown. We have hotels, bed and breakfasts. A lot of people come to Maysville from Cincinnati for a day trip, but you can certainly spend a couple of days here. I had, on the trolley tour the other day, I had people from New York, San Francisco. The other day we had someone from Trinidad because their son is here as a physician.
And I want to touch on, you mentioned earlier to me about how everybody knows somebody from Maysville. And you want to touch on that?
Yeah, Duff Giffen, the former tourism director, and I used to talk about, we'd go somewhere or someone would say they ran into someone. I went to New York City. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to run into anybody from Maysville in New York City. Ran into the same people twice in Manhattan. Garth Brooks has a sweatshirt, Maysville, the center of the universe. You know, we brag a lot. I told you before we started, Maysville has always thought bigger than we are. I mean, we had streetcars. You know, we've got this big airport. We're small, but we don't think small. And I really think our identity, you know, we're far enough from Cincinnati and Lexington that we are our own identity. You know, if you listen to the news or the weather, like we had a tornado warning last night, you know, we are on the edge of the Cincinnati market. I mean, they take our ratings. You'll hear a lot of references to Maysville. Come see us. I do trolley tours every Friday at noon. You can do special tours. There's walking tours. I mentioned Washington's open. The museum you must see. And they have changing exhibits. If you have children, they have right now an exhibit, Thomas the Train. Coming up in January, they're going to have a photo exhibit from the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yes, and I also want to mention that Robert Boone is actually joining us on Facebook Live as well. So thank you for tuning in, Robert. And we've got a chat that we actually did with him that we're going to be airing soon. So that'll be coming. And I see Deborah, I want to answer your question. Yes, this presentation is recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and on the museum's website at bcmuseum.org. Our YouTube channel is at BC Museum, so I encourage everyone to follow us and like us. So subscribe there, please. Heather, did I miss any? I know somebody else mentioned we could have a part 2 to this series if you decide to come back and talk some more.
Be glad to. Maybe I can get Ron on here. Ron and I are kind of a team. We tag team some, so maybe I can get him to join me.
I think that would be fun. That would be great.
You really need to check out that Facebook page because there's some amazing photos. There's a lot of celebrities. Chris France, who's the drummer in Talking Heads, is on there. His grandparents actually lived in that Marshall Key house in the 1960s, and Chris would spend some summers here. And he actually wrote a memoir and did his book signing here a couple of years ago. He and Tina Weymouth, the bassist in the band, were married at the Presbyterian Church in Washington. So there's all kinds of tentacles that stretch out for Maysville.
Yes. And you mentioned to me earlier too, if you look online and you Google Maysville, you'll see a picture of Garth Brooks in a Maysville t-shirt.
Right. In more than one photo. So he's worn it more than once.
Yes. Yes. Ron's page again, what was that page? Someone asked.
You may be from Maysville if you remember. All kinds of photos. I mean, and then people are always contributing.
And then we have a question from Donna. Is Maryland Dam named after that Maryland that you mentioned?
No, Markland. No, I believe that's a different Markland.
I see Markland. Shoot.
That dam was built a long time before much was known about Epsilon Markland. He actually was a correspondent for the Louisville Courier-Journal under the pen name of Oily Buckshot. They got that nickname on the steamboats. Anyway, he actually wrote to a Dr. Pfister in Maysville, and they printed a lot of letters, and he would reminisce about his time in Maysville. So really interesting. But that story of him, he is really credited with keeping the morale up of the soldiers.
Great. And then Heather's got that name of that Facebook page in our chat if anybody's interested. You may be from Maysville if you remember. So Heather, do we have any other, I don't know if we had any questions on Facebook?
I don't believe we did.
Okay, well, if that's it, I guess we're ready to go ahead and wrap up unless anyone else has some questions. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I do hope that maybe you can come back and do another one.
Be glad to.
If you have a topic that you would like to see on the program, please email me, Mary Jane, at communications@bcmuseum.org. I would love to hear your ideas. For more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where you can find the latest Curators Chat and all of our past Northern Kentucky History Hour presentations. Please like and subscribe. And that's all we have time for this evening. So thank you again to all of our sponsors and supporters of BCM. Until next time, everyone, take care and good night. And thank you, Danny and Heather.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.